Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Empowered Consulting's Social Justice Podcast series. This podcast was created on behalf of the Social Justice Committee to educate and raise awareness on different topics within the social impact and education. We are your hosts for this episode. I'm Yashish and I'm a sophomore at NYU.
And I'm Mira and I'm a senior at NYU. We'd like to introduce our guest for this episode, Dr. Thomas Gold, an adjunct associate professor of education studies at NYU, where he teaches courses in education, entrepreneurship, and consulting. He is also an education consultant and has worked with diverse organizations, including Junior Achievement Worldwide, Digital Promise, and the Anti-Defamation
League. Great. Hi, everybody. Mira, Yashi, it's great to meet you. Yes, I am an adjunct associate professor, teach the education entrepreneurship, education consulting in the education studies department. I'm also a senior associate partner at Bellwether Education Partners, which is a national nonprofit that seeks to address issues in education equity through research and policy and strategy.
So in regards to your experience with education entrepreneurship, we'd like to know in what ways do you see education entrepreneurship contributing to greater equity in education?
Yeah, that's a great question. When people think of education or when they think of entrepreneurship, they generally think of business, but they don't always think about the use of entrepreneurship to solve problems. Education entrepreneurs are essentially trying to solve problems in education, trying to address issues of equity and other issues in education, but usually through a market-based solution. And not just a market-based solution. It might be a solution that's both market-based but also is a public-private collaborative that is, again, seeking to solve problems. So education entrepreneurship is a way of trying to solve issues that are not necessarily focused on policy solutions. Again, there might be a market solution to the issue.
That's very interesting. So you mentioned that you come up with market solutions, and that could include, forming new organizations, etc. And starting a new education organization from scratch does sound very intimidating. So could you share some roadblocks that an education entrepreneur might face for our audience?
Sure. And again, just to give you examples, education entrepreneurship can take many forms. It could be, starting an initiative like Teach for America. Wendy Kopp, her initiative is a good example of education entrepreneurship. She found a challenge with around teaching and the importance of finding high qualified teachers. So she developed Teach for America. Sal Khan is another great example of an education entrepreneur of bringing digital solutions to education. So in terms of potential roadblocks, I would say that like any entrepreneur or any kind of person trying to solve a solution is, let's say, not thinking entrepreneurially, not thinking creatively about your solution, getting kind of stuck in a certain way of trying to solve a problem. Maybe it's, for example, you're trying to hammer away at a policy solution and it's not working, or you're trying to find some other kind of solution. I think one of the things that would probably characterize a successful ed entrepreneur or any entrepreneur is thinking in a way that's that's creative, that's open-minded, that's bringing in new ideas and being open to new ideas. The other challenge, of course, is not really identifying the right problem. In my education entrepreneurship course, we spend a lot of time focusing on the problem. In fact, we probably spend half the class focusing on the problem. And sometimes it confuses students, thinking, when do we start talking about the solution? When do we talk about this great idea that I have? Well, as we always say, it's if you don't have the fit between your solution and what the problem is, you're really probably not going to have a successful entrepreneurial idea. So you really have to really identify that problem. And that's where you have to do a lot of this, customer research, understand who your customer is. And I put that in quotes because it's not always someone who's buying your product. It's also who's using it, who's promoting it. So really trying to understand what the problem is and what problem that your customer is trying to solve. And the other roadblock I would say is thinking too individually and not collaboratively. I mean, entrepreneurship is actually a collaborative exercise. It's not this notion that it's an individual that's going out there, a lone wolf that's solving the problems. Often, sort of a mythical idea is really not the reality. The reality is that it's a collaborative effort, and you're bringing in those ideas from other people from outside.
So, Dr. Gold, we know you're involved with Bellwether Education Partners, which again, for our audience, is a nonprofit organization that's focused on improving education and life outcomes for underserved children. So what are some key things that education organizations can do to have a significant impact on their students' growth?
Yeah, I mean, there's organizations that focus on education. There's a lot of things they should think about in terms of student growth. I mean, the first thing is to define what growth means. There are a number of areas that students can grow in, a number of directions that organizations can focus on. I think the important part is to define that. Are you looking at student achievement? Are you looking at, performance, let's say, in certain areas? Or are you looking at things like social and emotional growth, or addressing well-being of students? It's really important to define that. I think when you don't define what your outcomes are going to be, it's much harder to try and achieve that goal. It's also much harder to measure your success if you don't have a clear outcome. One of the things we do in our work a lot is called logic models. Now you create a logic model to understand what are the outcomes that you're trying to really seek, that you're trying to achieve, and what are the steps to get there. And when you set up a logic model, you can break that down, and it helps you do a couple things. Helps you really identify what are the activities and the resources that you really need to be successful for that outcome. And you also start to define what are the metrics I should be tracking in order to measure success of that initiative. So again, I would say defining defining what your outcome is going to be is a key factor in success of an education organization. Finding ways to measure your success, which again would be through that logic model. And again, I would say, take an inclusive approach. It's important that if you're trying to solve an education challenge, it's really important that you're getting feedback from the communities that you're serving, and that inclusive approach. So people in the community are actually contributing to the conversation and helping to develop it and design it.
Thanks a lot for that. So we also know that you've previously held leadership positions at the New York Department of Education. So could you tell us where you see some of the most promising developments in education, including research?
Yeah, I think that there's both K-12. You mentioned the New York State Department of Education. There's also higher education. And I would say, just what's on the top of my mind right now is actually thinking about higher education, particularly because I'm teaching there right now. I think, and there's a lot of changes going on and a lot of thinking around higher education, particularly since the pandemic, both in K-12 and in higher education. I think in higher ed, is thinking of this idea of where can the liberal arts incorporate also more sort of applied learning or applied skills. I mean, the liberal arts is a great approach to learning what we call transversal skills that can be used across disciplines, regardless of what career you choose. And that's really always been the focus of the liberal arts. But I think there's a new focus too now of what about, there's some other skills like critical thinking and creativity and problem solving. Are there other things that we should be thinking about, other types of courses or other types of training that young people need in order to be successful in careers in the future? And I would say this is both higher ed and in K-12. Some of the things that we're doing in liberal studies, which in education studies, and the courses that I'm teaching are really fusing the liberal arts with some of these applied skills. So, more project-based learning, for example. So where you're learning not just the content and being able to describe what you're learning or to let's say focus on a test or let's say a paper, but also to be able to put together a project and have that be part of your learning. So project-based learning is an innovative approach that's been used a lot in K-12 and is being used, I think, even more so, in higher education. So bringing in that, thinking about it at the higher ed level in terms of liberal arts and bringing in more of sort of this applied learning. And this, I would say the same thing at the K-12 level. Thinking really again about, how can we train or how can we bring in more opportunities to develop these kinds of skills that we know are useful and are engaging. I think it's also another way of engaging students in learning, engaging them in the process of solving problems and coming up with new ideas. In terms of research, it's a corollary to that, and that is, well, like anything in education, it's really important to be able to measure your outcome. All right, I was just talking about that before. So one of the challenges, of course, that we have if you're teaching these kinds of innovative skills like critical thinking and problem solving is, well, how do we measure it? How do we know if you have a critical thinker, if you have a problem solver? And so thinking of innovative ways of measuring that, I would say, and there's a lot of innovative research being done out there. I did some earlier work on measuring entrepreneurial mindset, and thinking of ways of developing assessments to pick up on these skills. So thinking of ways of how can we actually measure, these skills so that we can, once we are able to measure things, we're able to track it and we're able to follow it. And we're also able to use that information to make improvements on whatever we're teaching or training. So I think as again, education evolves, we're developing a better capacity to do that, to measure those skills.
So as we wrap up our conversation today, we wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts regarding educational equity that you would like to share with the audience.
I think in this post-COVID world, COVID was in many ways a major disruption in education. And you're probably hearing this from a lot of the folks that you're talking to. I mean, it's a huge disruption. And it's still ongoing, I mean, in terms of the repercussions of COVID. But I also think it's been an opportunity to rethink education and rethink how can we make education more equitable. It's certainly highlighted a lot of the gaps that exist out there at all levels of education. And it certainly made people more aware of the gaps, and it made the gaps, it put a light on the gaps and help us try to understand it more. So I think the opportunity that we have right now is to try and take what we've learned through this process, use it as a learning process, and to try and see where we can address some of these. And I do think that there's definitely some efforts that are being made, and I think some opportunities that we're going to see in the future to address inequities in education. But again, I think COVID has been, in that sense, kind of a wake-up call, and in an odd way, an opportunity to address these issues.
But yeah, so I think that ends our conversation. We want to thank you a lot, Dr. Gold, for taking time out of your day to speak with us and share your insights with the empowered community. And to our audience, thanks a lot for watching this video, and goodbye.
All right. Well, thank you both, and good luck with finals.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.